The smell drifting from her chamber was so strong it felt like a warning in the air, a thick, sour heaviness that made even the bravest courtiers stop in their tracks. These were men who had walked through battle smoke, past dying soldiers, across fields spoiled by war, and hunger, yet the odor coming from one woman's room forced them to step back with trembling hands pressed over their lips. Their eyes watered, their chests tightened. Some whispered prayers without even knowing why. That was the beginning of the final suffering of Agnes Sorel, the woman whose beauty once changed. The fate of France, whose charm shaped kings and councils, and whose power made enemies whisper her name with both fear and admiration. What happened to her did not come from rumor or myth. It was real. It was hidden behind velvet curtains and gold embroidery, beneath jewels and silk, buried under the lies the court used to protect its pride. And if you're ready to step into this story, prepare yourself. Because not everyone can face what destroyed the woman once praised as perfection itself. This is the tale of how the brightest star in the French court began to fall. Not from scandal or betrayal, but from something growing quietly inside her body long before anyone understood what it meant. Agnes Sorel ruled the heart of King Charles not through a crown, but through the force of her presence. Chroniclers called her the Lady of Beauty, the first woman ever recognized as an official royal favorite. She stood beside the king when the Valois throne shook, when France hung between hope and ruin. In the halls of Chinon, she moved like a soft glow of light, her gowns covered in pearls. Her skin so bright poets claimed candle flames leaned toward her. Soldiers admired her confidence. Ministers feared her influence. And the king, so often lost in doubt, seemed to breathe with new life whenever she entered a room. But beauty cannot protect what hides deep inside the body. In the first days of January 1450, Agnes returned from a long, tiring journey through cold roads and endless meetings. During the last stretch of travel, she had felt small cramps, a strange twisting beneath her ribs, but she blamed it on exhaustion. That night, in the warm chamber prepared for her at Le Mans, she woke suddenly, clutching her stomach. A sharp pain shot through her, so strong it knocked her from the bed. Her knees hit the floor, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her cries were swallowed by the soft furs covering the room. At sunrise, she insisted everything was fine. Her face was pale, but her voice calm. She welcomed the king's messengers with her usual grace. She sipped mint water to steady her stomach and asked her maids to arrange her hair in careful curls, hiding the tremble in her hands. Appearance was her armor, and she wore it well. But the servants closest to her already sensed something wrong. Her breath carried a faint sickly sweetness, an odor that felt unnatural, like something breaking down far beneath the skin. And when she leaned forward, a thin but persistent smell rose from her body, enough to make the bravest maid glance away. By the third day, the pain sharpened. Something inside her began to shift with an unsettling force, as if an unseen cord tightened around her organs. Walking became a struggle. Her stomach swelled, not softly, but in sudden, pulsing waves. When she pressed her hands to her abdomen, she felt movements quick, twisting motions that made her gasp. She whispered prayers under her breath, begging for the sensation to stop. Servants exchanged frightened looks. Physicians rushed to her side, muttering about bad humors or an imbalance of bile. But they avoided saying what their eyes revealed: the terrifying possibility of living creatures inside her. They dared not speak such a shame aloud about the woman most beloved by the king. Agnes tried to hide the truth. She wore heavier gowns, tightened at the waist. She burned lavender and rosemary to soften the growing smell in her rooms. But nothing could stop the slow cracking of the beauty that had once enchanted an entire nation. At meals, she could barely take a single bite. The moment food touched her tongue, a wave of nausea rose so suddenly she had to turn away. Her appetite vanished. Her once glowing skin lost its shine, turning dull, then clammy, then marked with a strange grey shadow beneath the surface. She shivered constantly, even when wrapped in velvet and fur. Nights brought no rest. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking soaked in sweat, her heartbeat quick and uneven, like something frightened trapped inside her chest. Still, she kept silent. But silence cannot stop rumors. The courtiers noticed her absence from gatherings. They whispered about the change in her walk, her trembling fingers, her refusal to allow anyone near her bed. Some insisted she had been poisoned by jealous rivals. Others whispered of God's punishment for a love that crossed the lines of marriage and tradition. When King Charles came to see her, she refused him gently, claiming she only needed rest. "I am only tired from travel," she said softly. But her voice weakened, and when she turned away to cough, the king caught a glimpse of pain twisting her beautiful face into something strained and unfamiliar. By the start of the second week, everything worsened. The swelling in her abdomen grew larger, round and tight. Pain struck without warning, making her clutch tables, walls, anything to keep herself from falling. Then came the vomiting, violent, unstoppable. She brought up more than bile. Thin, white shapes appeared in the mess, writhing for a moment before going still. A maid saw it happen and ran screaming down the corridor. Convinced she had witnessed something unholy, the physicians returned in haste. This time, they could not hide the truth. They spoke in low voices, ashamed to say it aloud. Agnes was likely suffering from a severe infestation of Ascaris worms, long, pale parasites that curled through the intestines and rose into the stomach when the body weakened. Such creatures thrived in tainted food or water, multiplying until their host could no longer bear their presence. The news spread through the palace like fire leaping across dry wood. Courtiers avoided her entire wing. Servants begged to be transferred. Even priests hesitated, uncertain whether this was disease or some spiritual curse. Agnes, once the shining jewel of France, now found herself surrounded by fear instead of admiration. As the days passed, the smell grew stronger. It was not the scent of ordinary illness. It was the smell of something dying from the inside. The worms had multiplied, causing swelling, bleeding, and burning fevers. Sweat rolled down her skin. Her golden hair darkened and clung to her damp temples. Her eyes sank deep into their sockets. Yet she remained aware enough to understand her fate. The creatures inside her were not only destroying her health, they were taking her beauty, her influence, her legacy, and she could not stop them. The decline of Agnes Sorel happened so quickly it frightened even those who once envied her. Within days, her condition slipped into something the court had no words for. The chateau at Le Mans, once filled with warm scents of wine and sweet resins, now echoed with a sharp, sour smell that clung to every surface. Servants walked the halls quietly, afraid the walls themselves might absorb the odor and whisper it back. Everyone now understood the king's beloved was dying and dying in a terrible way. Agnes could barely stand. When she tried to rise, a heavy pressure surged inside her swollen stomach, as if something large pushed outward from beneath her skin. Her trembling hands held her belly, feeling the faint crawling motion that sometimes rippled under her ribs. She bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. She had once carried royal children inside her body, now she carried living invaders. The physicians tried to calm the court. They brought bitter drinks mixed with wormwood and tansy, powders of salt and crushed herbs, and thick liquids so strong they burned her throat. But her body rejected all of it. Hours later, she vomited violently onto the tiled floor. Blood, bile, and long pale shapes that twisted weakly before going still. One maid fainted. Another fled the room, crying that the worms were stealing Agnes's soul. Rumors took hold instantly. Some said she was cursed for her beauty and her closeness to the king. Others believed poison had been slipped into her food to rot her from inside. Rather than kill her quickly, King Charles demanded answers. He slammed his hand on the table while speaking to the physicians, but they lowered their eyes. No remedy, no prayer, no bleeding ritual could undo what had begun. He insisted on seeing her. Agnes refused, out of pride and shame, but the king would not be stopped. When he entered her room, he found her sitting upright, trying to appear calm. The moment she shifted, pain tightened around her middle, and she bent forward with a quiet, broken moan. Her once shining hair hung in damp strands across her face. The court itself began to crack under the weight of fear. Advisors begged the king to keep his distance, to protect the royal image before the scandal spread. Others urged him to bring foreign doctors, alchemists, even mystics. But the truth was simple and horrifying. Agnes was being eaten alive. On the morning of the 8th day, she collapsed beside her bed. Maids rushed in, only to recoil at the sight of her abdomen so swollen it looked stretched to breaking. Her skin was tight and shiny, veins rising beneath the pale surface. Whenever she breathed, the mound seemed to ripple faintly, as if the creatures inside her were shifting in response. The chief physician touched her stomach gently. Agnes screamed a raw, tearing sound, and something under her skin moved sharply, as though disturbed by his touch. A servant ran from the room, swearing she saw a bulge slide across Agnes's abdomen like an animal trying to escape. The physician ordered everyone out. Alone, he whispered prayers he barely remembered. Never had he seen an infestation this severe, not in peasants, not in soldiers, and certainly not in a woman of such rank. He tried once more to give her wine mixed with herbs, but she vomited it all up, along with more worms tangled in mucus and blood. By midday, the smell in her chamber had become unbearable. It clung to hair, clothes, skin. Yet the king ordered she must never be left alone. Courtiers stood guard with perfumed cloths over their faces, watching her tremble, sweat, and fight for breath. No one dared imagine how much worse the nights would become. At night, the suffering grew darker. Agnes often woke with a sharp gasp, clutching her throat as if something were climbing upward inside her. One night, as the candles flickered low, she felt a pressure rising through her chest. Her eyes widened in terror. The maids hurried to lift her right just as she began retching. A burst of bile spilled from her mouth, and within it, long pale worms shining in the candlelight as they hit the floor. The maids dropped her in shock. Her head struck the wooden frame, but she didn't react. She stared at the writhing creatures with a trembling hand raised weakly, as though trying to push the nightmare away. The woman once praised as heaven's beauty now looked hollow, her body no longer her own. Outside her chamber, the court trembled not only for her fate, but for what her suffering revealed about the weakness of those close to power. By the 10th day, the chateau felt haunted. The quiet was heavy. Candles burned at every corner. Courtiers stuffed herbs under doorways, scattered salt on floors, and whispered prayers. Some wore charms blessed by nervous priests. Others refused to eat food from the same kitchen that served Agnes. No one agreed on what caused her torment: disease, magic, poison, or punishment. But everyone agreed on one truth. Something inside her was destroying her in a way too horrifying to speak of openly. Agnes, once surrounded by admirers, now found herself almost alone. Only a few servants stayed, driven by duty or fear. Even they avoided her eyes. Her face had lost all softness. Her cheeks were sharp, her lips cracked and blue-gray, her once bright eyes flickering between clarity and confusion. But the most terrifying sight was her abdomen. It no longer looked human. It swelled into a stretched mound, shining with fevered sweat. At times it pulsed. At other moments it shivered with slow, snake-like motions beneath the skin. Even the bravest physicians touched her only briefly, afraid that any pressure might stir the creatures inside. Her body had become a battleground, and the court could only stand at the edges, helpless and horrified. On the 11th night, a storm crashed outside. The wind beat the shutters. Rain slammed against stone walls, as if nature itself recoiled from what was happening within. Agnes lay curled on her side, breathing in short broken bursts. She had eaten nothing in a day. Everything she swallowed came back up in violent spasms. Her breaths grew shallow. Each one ended in a low moan. As the night deepened and the candles shrank, she suddenly jerked awake. Her body trembled. One spasm hit, then another. She clutched her stomach and screamed. Two physicians ran in and tried to steady her as her back arched and her limbs shook. Sweat poured down her face. Her mouth opened in a silent cry as her belly lifted in one grotesque bulge. One physician pressed lightly against it. Agnes shrieked. Something moved under her skin, slowly rising, then sinking again. The physician jumped away, pale with fear. Agnes fell back, exhausted, tears sliding down her temples. What sin, she whispered, could deserve this? No one dared answer. By then the palace was drowning in fear. Ministers argued over covering up the illness. Soldiers begged to leave their post. Courtiers fled the chateau entirely. Rumors spread like sparksworms crawling under floorboards, demons drawn to her beauty, curses placed on the king's favorite. And the worst was yet to come. By the 12th day, even the king was warned not to enter her chamber. His advisers feared what would happen if he saw the full horror of her condition. Charles tried to ignore them, but after witnessing her collapse earlier, even he began to hesitate. Not out of lack of love, but because he felt powerless. He spent hours outside her door, listening to her painful breaths through the thick wood. Agnes sensed him nearby. Even in her fever, she whispered, "Is he there? Does he still care?" But no one had the heart to tell her that the king stood only a few steps away. Unable to face the sight of her agony. By the 14th day, she could not rise from her bed at all. The creatures inside her had multiplied so much that her stomach looked alive, always moving, always shifting. Her skin felt burning hot. Fever swept through her like fire. Sometimes she spoke clearly, remembering old days in the court, the king's smile, the jewels she once wore. Other times she drifted into hallucinations, insisting something was crawling up her throat, down her arms, behind her eyes. Isabeau tried to calm her, but Agnes grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Save me," she begged. "Please." Isabeau's voice trembled as she told her nothing was there, but both of them knew she was lying. Another convulsion struck. Her body arched with such force the bed creaked beneath her. Physicians rushed in as her limbs shook uncontrollably. The attack lasted half an hour until she finally lay limp, barely breathing. The doctors stared at her swollen abdomen, the tight, trembling skin, the faint ripples sliding beneath the surface, and they knew she was fading. Whatever came next would be worse. By the 15th day, the chateau round her had fallen into a state of fearful silence. The tapestries hung untouched, the candles burned low. The hallways no longer echoed with music or gossip. Inside her chamber, Agnes lay still on the bed that once represented her power. Now she looked like a shadow of herself, pale, exhausted, and frighteningly fragile, as though the structure of her body was collapsing from within. Her fever had eaten away her last strength. Her skin, once compared to pearls, was slick with sweat and nearly colorless. But her abdomen remained monstrous. The swollen mound pushed the fabric of her gown upward. Sometimes small ripples moved across it, slow and unsettling, as though something inside was refusing to die. The physicians barely dared to touch her. Each time they approached, Agnes cried out not the soft gasp of a court favorite, but a sharp, raw scream that echoed through the halls. Agnes drifted between worlds. She whispered prayers, then nonsense, then names of people who weren't there. Once, in a rare moment of clarity, she reached for Isabeau's hand. Her voice was barely a breath as she asked, "Will they remember me kindly?" The truth was harsh. The court had already turned her suffering into a spectacle, not a sorrow. They said she rose too high. They said the natural world punished her for being loved by a king. But no poison was needed when worms were already finishing the work. Near dawn on the 16th day, her body began to tremble again. Her back arched, and her hands clutched the sheets. Her breaths came in rattling bursts. The physicians hurried toward her, but before they could reach the bed, her stomach surged upward in a wave so violent that everyone gasped. Her eyes flew open, wide with terror. She tried to speak, but instead she gagged, convulsing so intensely the bed shook. Then it happened. A choke scream tore from her throat as something forced its way upward from inside her chest. She retched violently. A flood of worms poured from her mouth, mixed with blood and bile. They splattered onto the floor in a tangled, glistening mass. A maid fainted instantly. Another ran from the room sobbing. One of the physicians stumbled backward, covering his face. Agnes collapsed onto her pillow, gasping as though drowning. Her eyes no longer focused. Her fingers twitched weakly. Her breaths came faster and faster until they suddenly stopped. Her body sank into stillness. Outside, the storm's wind struck the window as if marking the moment. When word reached Charles, he didn't shout. He didn't fall. He simply closed his eyes and let his sword fall from his hand. The woman who pulled him out of despair, who made him believe in himself again, who stood beside him like no other gone. Not by treason, not by war, but by something too small to see until it was far too late. The court moved quickly. Her chamber was sealed. Servants washed until their hands cracked. Priests arrived. Physicians argued. Some whispered about poison. But the truth was plain. The worms had eaten through her intestines, ruptured organs, and unleashed an infection her body could not survive. Rumors said an autopsy was done to silence all doubts. When her abdomen was opened, the truth became undeniable. Her organs were swollen and torn, filled with coiling parasites, some still moving. The sight silenced every rumor instantly. No human plot had caused this. Nature had done what enemies could not. Her funeral was rushed and quiet. Few dared approach her coffin. The king ordered honors, but no musicians played. No crowds gathered. Only the cold wind carried her memory away. For years, people avoided speaking her name. It felt safer to pretend her story had never happened. Our history does not forget. Agnes the Bright, the admired, the destroyed remains a reminder of how fragile power truly is, how fast beauty can decay, and how something so small can erase even the most unforgettable life. And in the end, it wasn't scandal or betrayal that killed the king's beloved. It was hunger. The hunger of worms and the silence of a court too afraid to intervene. After her quiet burial, the chateau tried to return to normal life, but nothing truly did. The corridors felt emptier, the rooms colder, as if the walls themselves remembered her cries. Servants avoided the wing where she died. Courtiers lowered their voices whenever her name slipped out. Even the king walked like a man carrying a shadow that would never lift. Time moved forward, but Agnes's final days clung to the palace like a stain no one could wash away. People spoke of her in whispers, afraid the truth of her end might somehow reach beyond the grave. Some claimed the scent of her illness still lingered in the stones. Others said her beauty had been too bright, that the world punished her for shining too much. Yet history, relentless as always, kept her memory alive not as a tale of glory, but as a warning about how quickly fortune can break. How even the most admired lives can be undone by something no one can see. Something too small for any crown to stop. And now, as you've walked through this story, Let me ask you something Agnes never had the chance to know. Where are you watching from? Tell me your country, your city, your corner of the world in the comments. If this story held your attention, if it made you feel even a spark of curiosity or disbelief, then like the video, share it with someone who loves history, and comment below. Your support helps bring hidden stories like this back into the light. Stories the world tried to erase, but that still deserve to be heard.